Before the outbreak of World War II, Western military experts looked at Japanese aviation with outright condescension. They dismissed it as weak and hopelessly obsolete. The general consensus was that Japanese engineers simply did not have what it took to design modern combat aircraft with truly high performance and heavy armament. But that kind of overconfidence eventually cost the United States and Britain dearly. When the Western Allies ran into a formidable lineup of aircraft sporting red roundels in fierce combat over the Pacific, they suddenly discovered that these airplanes did not just match their Western counterparts. They often outclassed them across the board. Of course, you do not build an air force that capable overnight. The secret was that back in the early 1930s, Japan had heavily invested in developing and adopting cutting-edge aircraft, and they began fielding these advanced airplanes across practically every combat role. For example, in early 1934, Mitsubishi began testing an all-metal, twin-engine bomber featuring fully retractable landing gear. This aircraft was designated the G-3M. Right up until the outbreak of the wider war, it served as the primary land-based bomber for Japanese naval aviation, proving highly effective during combat operations in China. The very next year, the Mitsubishi A-5M fighter took to the skies. It became one of the world's first purpose-built, carrier-based monoplanes. It was a truly cutting-edge fighter for its time. This was a fact Soviet pilots learned the hard way when they went up against it in the skies over China and Khalkhin Gol. Japan's seaplane development kept pace as well. Because Japan was gearing up for a massive war across the vast expanses of the Pacific, the Navy absolutely needed a modern, long-range maritime patrol aircraft. That same year, 1934, the aviation brass of the Imperial Japanese Navy laid out clear requirements for a new flying boat under the 9-Sure specification. The main goal for the engineers was to design an aircraft that would outclass any flying boat fielded by a potential enemy, namely the United States and Great Britain, right out of the gate. According to the requirement, while maintaining a cruising speed of around 138 miles per hour, the new patrol plane had to boast a range of over 2,760 miles. On top of that, it had to carry a heavy payload consisting of several bombs or 2 massive 800-kilogram torpedoes. The heavy responsibility of fulfilling this 9-Sure requirement was awarded to Kawanishi. At the time, they were Japan's most experienced manufacturer when it came to building large flying boats. Back in the early 1930s, Kawanishi's engineering team had produced a series of massive biplane flying boats for the Navy, designated as the H6K. These were developed with heavy support from the British company Short Brothers, using the famous Short Calcutta flying boat as a baseline. But this time around, the project's chief designer, Shizuo Kikuhara, decided to abandon the outdated biplane concept entirely. Instead, he went with a parasol monoplane design. In this setup, a single, massive wing sat high above the hull, braced by a network of supporting struts. To give the aircraft that unprecedented range, the wing itself had to be absolutely gigantic. The wingspan stretched to just over 131 feet. This was almost twice the length of the flying boat's hull. Up until that point, a flying boat with a wingspan that large had never been built, not just in Japan, but anywhere in the world. The all-metal wing was rectangular with rounded tips. It was supported internally by a robust load-bearing structure. Flight control surfaces ran along almost the entire trailing edge. This gave a massive aircraft like this the stability and maneuverability it needed. The wing was mounted to the hull using a pair of heavy-duty inverted V-struts. These were arranged in tandem. Large bracing struts ran from the lower hull to tie into the wing. Where these struts crossed and were reinforced, engineers added hardpoints. This is where they slung the payload of bombs or heavy torpedoes. To keep the aircraft stable on the water, outboard floats were mounted under the wings. They were fixed in place on metal struts and cross-braced with rigging wire. This meant they were non-retractable. The flying boat hull was also all metal, its hydrodynamic design heavily borrowed from the proven engineering of their British partners at Short Brothers. Inside was a spacious flight deck. It featured oversized windows that gave the crew excellent visibility. Up front, the pilot and co-pilot sat side by side. The commander, navigator, radio operator, and flight engineer were stationed directly aft. The crew complement also included an observer who manned the open nose gun position. He was armed with a 7.7mm Type 92 machine gun. Another gunner with an identical weapon sat in a glass-enclosed tail turret. This was positioned just aft of the large twin tail. The gunners had to manually aim the nose and tail guns. However, a third firing position was located in a dorsal blister just aft of the wings. This mount was electrically powered, a genuine first for Japanese military aviation. Whenever an aerial threat appeared, the radio operator would man this power-driven dorsal gun to fend off attackers. Powering this massive flying boat were four 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engines. These were Nakajima Hikari 2s, each cranked out 700 horsepower on takeoff. They drove reliable 3-bladed Sumitomo propellers. These measured well over 10 feet in diameter. To give the aircraft the necessary range, aviation fuel was distributed across 6 tanks. These were housed inside the wings. For extended endurance missions, auxiliary fuel tanks could be installed in a dedicated compartment inside the hull. The prototype of this new flying boat took to the skies for its maiden flight on July 14, 1936. Factory testing went incredibly well. It was immediately clear that the engineering team had built a highly capable aircraft. Just 11 days later, the flying boat was handed over to Navy pilots for operational trials. The Navy pilots were impressed with the new design. However, they did have a few concerns. They asked the engineering team to improve directional stability. They also wanted the aircraft to be more responsive during water taxiing. Crews also pointed out that the aircraft felt slightly underpowered for an airframe of its size. The design team got straight to work on the modifications. To address the directional stability, they shifted the hull step forward by about 20 inches. They also extended the aileron span and increased the overall surface area of the empennage. The engineers took the engine feedback to heart as well. They agreed to upgrade to 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 radial engines. These new engines boasted a takeoff rating of 1,000 horsepower each. There was just one problem. Those engines were not available at the factory yet. As a result, they decided to wrap up testing on the initial prototypes using the older engines. The next phase of operational trials took place in Yokohama. This was at the base of the local Kokutai, the Japanese equivalent of a naval air group. That is where the first, third, and fourth prototypes finally received their upgraded engines. Following this, the aircraft was officially accepted into service. It was designated as the Type 97 Flying Boat Model 1, or simply the H6K1. Shortly after, the Kawanishi Aircraft Company received a massive order from the Navy for full-scale production. Following those initial airframes, the factory rolled out a batch of 10 pre-production flying boats. They were given the updated designation H6K2. They differed from their predecessors only through minor tweaks to their internal systems. The performance of the H6K2 was genuinely impressive. With a standard takeoff weight of over 35,000 pounds, the flying boat could hit 206 miles per hour. It achieved this at an altitude of 6,900 feet. Even with a full payload of bombs or torpedoes, it had a range of over 2,500 miles. And if the crews throttled back to a cruising speed of 138 miles per hour, the aircraft could stay aloft on continuous patrol for a staggering 19 hours. Interestingly, the first conflict the H6K2 saw action in was somewhat unconventional. In the winter of 1939, tensions flared between the Soviet Union and Japan over fishing rights in the Strait of Tartary and the Sea of Okhotsk. To apply psychological pressure on the Soviets, the Japanese decided to deploy their brand new flying boats. 4 aircraft were hastily deployed from Yokohama to the frozen north. They operated under the official guise of cold weather flight training. However, Japanese historians believe it was this overt display of a state-of-the-art, long-range maritime patrol aircraft, a capability the Soviet Union simply did not possess at the time, that forced the Soviets to the negotiating table. It resulted in an agreement highly favorable to Japanese fishermen. But these flying boats were put through their paces not just in the frozen north, they were also tested down in the sweltering tropics. An intensive training program was launched around the Marshall Islands. The operational tempo was grueling. Crews executed countless open ocean takeoffs and landings, both day and night. They even practiced complex refueling operations from seaplane tenders far from their home bases. However, the primary objective of these flights was detailed photographic reconnaissance. the Japanese aircrews did not restrict themselves to their own airspace. They flew sorties over the Gilbert Islands. These islands were under British control at the time. During one of these covert overflights, the British actually spotted a Japanese flying boat. But for whatever reason, they never filed an official protest. Thanks to risky missions like these, Japanese crews gained invaluable experience. They practiced conducting long endurance flights over the vast expanses of the Pacific. This experience would later prove crucial during full-scale combat operations in the Pacific theater. The idea of operating the latest military aircraft on commercial air routes was highly appealing to the Japanese. The logic was simple and practical. Crews could hone their airmanship in real-world conditions while simultaneously hauling mail and commercial cargo. That's why the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service struck a deal with Dai Nippon Airways. They transferred 2 of the massive H6K-2 flying boats to them for transport duties. Naturally, before these flights, all military equipment and armament were stripped from the aircraft. Instead, the spacious fuselage was outfitted with a cargo bay and 2 relatively comfortable passenger cabins. These cabins seated 8 and 10 passengers, respectively. This civilian variant was designated the H6K-2L. The historic moment came on April 4, 1939. On this day, the flying boat made its inaugural flight from Yokohama to the Palau Islands. Taking off at 6 a.m., the aircraft covered over 1,620 miles to the island of Saipan. The flight took 10.5 hours. It maintained an average speed of 162 miles per hour. At 7 a.m. the next morning, the crew began the second leg of the journey. By noon, the flying boat touched down safely in a quiet bay at Palau. The return trip followed the exact same route. On April 10th, the aircraft arrived safely back in Yokohama. At first, the military maintained strict control over the schedule. They dictated exactly when these flights would take place. This situation did not sit well with the airline's management. However, by late 1939, Dai Nippon Airways managed to secure the right to set their own schedules. From then on, the H6K-2L transports began flying these long-haul routes twice a week with remarkable punctuality. Recognizing the route's success, the airline ordered 16 more of these aircraft. This increased the flight frequency to 3 times a week by 1941. Their route network was also constantly expanding. In August 1940, they opened a new route. It stretched over 2,610 miles to the Marshall Islands. Later, in October 1941, the Yokohama to Palau route was extended even further south. It reached all the way to the island of Timor. These ultra-long-range flights operated smoothly right up until the attack on Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, military production carried on apace. After delivering the first 10 H6K-2 aircraft, Kawanishi built 2 specialized H6K-3 staff transports. These were designed exclusively for carrying high-ranking officers and VIPs. But the most significant variant was the H6K-4 long-range reconnaissance bomber, which became the most widely produced version. A total of 120 units rolled off the assembly line. To put that range in perspective, the fuel capacity on the H6K-4 was nearly 30,000 pounds, giving it a flight range of over 3,720 miles. The aircraft's defensive armament also saw some changes. Instead of a complicated power-operated dorsal turret, Japanese engineers opted for a machine gun in an open mount. They also installed another pair of machine guns in transparent waist blisters on the sides of the fuselage. The tail gunner's position was made much roomier. This was to accommodate a heavy-hitting 20mm Type 99 cannon instead of a standard machine gun. The heart of these giants remained the reliable Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 engines. However, starting in August 1941, they were upgraded to the slightly more powerful Kinsei 46 engines. These new flying boats steadily filled the ranks of the Yokohama Naval Air Group. Over the course of 1939, the unit fully transitioned to the new aircraft. This brought their total number of H6K series flying boats up to 24. The second military unit to be fully equipped with these massive aircraft was the Naval Air Group based in Taiwan. By November 1940, they had also taken delivery of 24 flying boats. And just before the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Sasebo Naval Air Group began its own re-equipment process. Alongside the purely military H6K-4 reconnaissance aircraft, Kawanishi produced 16 additional H6K-4L transport planes. These were built throughout 1940 for the commercial carrier Dai Nippon Airways. Powered by Kinsei 43 engines, their interiors closely resembled the earlier civilian models. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed its own transports as well. They took delivery of 20 H6K-4L aircraft, though these were upgraded with more powerful Kinsei 46 engines. Interestingly, on the military transport version, the flight deck featured noticeably fewer windows. The tailgun position was also retained, even though the variant was completely unarmed. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had 66 of these flying boats at its disposal. They were stationed at several key bases. These included Yokohama, Taiwan, Sasebo, and Yokosuka. As Japan prepared to attack the United States, High Command decided to forward deploy these massive flying boats. They were moved much closer to the anticipated combat zones. For instance, the aircraft from Yokohama were deployed to the Marshall Islands. Meanwhile, the air group from Taiwan relocated to Palau. Timed to coincide with the strike on Pearl Harbor, these flying boats were tasked with attacking American outposts on Howland and Baker Islands. Early in the morning on December 8th, the 4-engine Kawanishi flying boats navigated flawlessly to their targets. However, due to heavy radio interference, the formation commander never received the order to commence the attack. The aircraft turned back, but ultimately delivered their planned strike the following day. Later, on December 11th, crews from this same unit successfully bombed Wake Island. This provided crucial air support for the Japanese forces invading the American base. Meanwhile, the flying boats from Palau were redeployed to the Philippines. There, they conducted extensive maritime patrols around the Molucca Islands. On one of these reconnaissance flights, 6 Japanese flying boats even engaged a Dutch seaplane tender. In early January 1942, 8 flying boats flew their first combat mission. Their goal was to bomb the strategically important Allied base at Rabaul on the island of New Britain. Once Japanese forces finally secured the base, most of the squadron relocated to nearby Green Island. At the same time, 5 other aircraft were sent to the Gilbert Islands. From their new forward base, 8 H6Ks carried out 2 heavy night raids on Port Moresby throughout February. Then, on February 20th, the crews of the Kawanishi patrol aircraft spotted a large U.S. Navy task force out in the ocean. This force was led by the fleet carrier USS Lexington. The American ships were steaming toward Rabaul to retake the base. However, the operation was aborted. Following a heavy attack by Japanese land-based bombers, the American task force was forced to withdraw toward Hawaii. In the skies over the Pacific, Allied forces were encountering H6K flying boats with increasing frequency. To simplify the complex Japanese designation system, the Allies followed their standard practice of assigning short reporting names to enemy aircraft. Under this system, the military reconnaissance plane became known as Mavis, while the transport variant was dubbed Tilly. During long-range maritime patrols deep over the endless ocean, these aircraft had a very low chance of encountering enemy fighters. Because of this, their primary vulnerabilities were not a significant issue. These weaknesses included a complete lack of armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. But things changed drastically when these slow, lumbering aircraft were tasked with bombing ground targets. These targets were protected by heavy anti-aircraft fire. Under those conditions, surviving in a completely unarmored airframe was almost impossible for the crew. The lack of armor and unsealed fuel tanks were a major weakness for a lot of Japanese aircraft at the time. This forced designers to make changes right in the middle of the war. Interestingly, Kawanishi's new 4-engine flying boat, the H8K-1, was built specifically to replace the H6K. It also started out without any protection for the crew or the fuel. However, High Command quickly realized the issue. They ordered armored seatbacks for the pilots and self-sealing fuel tanks for the H8K-1. Why the older Mavis airframes never received a similar upgrade remains a mystery to historians. While Japanese industry was just gearing up for mass production of the new H8K-1, assembly of the older H6K was still in full swing. In 1941, the final variant of this seaplane rolled off the line, designated the H6K-5. It was equipped with more powerful Kinsei 51 engines, each producing 1,300 horsepower. Thanks to this upgrade, the aircraft's top speed increased to 239 miles per hour. reached at an altitude of 19,700 feet. Yet, even in this updated variant, designers still left the crew and fuel tanks completely unprotected. The only real improvement was to the defensive armament. This included adding a new turret with an extra 7.7mm machine gun positioned above the cockpit. In total, the Japanese only built 36 airframes of the H6K-5. By the start of 1942, the outdated Mavis was completely replaced on the assembly lines by the more modern H8K-1. This aircraft later received the Allied reporting name Emily. But ending production of this massive reconnaissance aircraft did not mean its military career was over. These flying boats continued their hazardous combat service across the vast expanses of the Pacific for a long time to come. A batch of the latest H6K-5s was assigned to the Yokohama Air Group. This group had just relocated to the Solomon Islands. In May 1942, operating from these new bases, the giant Mavis flying boats flew long-range reconnaissance missions during the Battle of the Coral Sea. However, on August 16th, American carrier aircraft caught the four-engine Kawanishis completely by surprise. The flying boats were attacked while moored at their bases. The strike was devastating, wiping out nearly all the aircraft. In the aftermath, the Imperial Japanese Navy flying boat fleet was left in a critical situation. Across this entire theater of operations, there were only 8 H6K airframes left in the Solomons. Along with them were just 3 of the newer H8Ks stationed at Rabaul, and another 3 at Shortland. Facing this severe shortage, Japanese High Command had to urgently transfer surviving H6Ks all the way from the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. By December 1942, Japanese naval air groups were operating a pretty mixed fleet. Alongside the proven H6K veterans, the much more modern and powerful H8K flying boats were entering service in large numbers. Then, in early 1943, a major milestone occurred in Japanese military aviation. Several H6K airframes were retrofitted with the most advanced technology of the era, radar. The antennas for these radar systems were mounted directly along the leading edge of the wing. This modification made these aircraft the very first Japanese planes to ever be equipped with radar. As the war entered its final and most desperate stage for Japan, the obsolete H6K saw far less action in long-range reconnaissance missions. It naturally gave way to the much more advanced and capable H8K. By early 1944, only 2 squadrons in the entire Japanese military were still actively flying the Mavis. Across other air groups, you would only find a handful of scattered H6Ks. By April 1945, Japanese naval aviation had almost entirely transitioned to land-based bombers. Despite this, a dozen miraculously surviving H6K flying boats were transferred to the air group at Asamo. They kept taking to the skies right up until the very end of the war. By this point, however, they were mostly just being used as standard transports. Worth noting, ever since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had been using dedicated cargo variants of the aircraft. These included models like the H6K-2L and H6K-4L. These heavy transport flying boats were assigned to reserve transport units. They were responsible for running supplies to the most remote outposts on the long route from Yokohama through Palau and all the way out to the Jaluit Atoll. While most of these supply runs stayed safely out of range of Allied bases, American forces still managed to intercept and shoot down several of these transports. In total, Japanese industry produced 215 of these flying boats across all variants. Even though this aircraft made its maiden flight way back in 1936, it served the fleet with true distinction right up until August 1945. It was only Japan's formal surrender that finally brought an end to the long service life of the Mavis and its Tilly transport variants. The design had one fatal weakness. The engineers omitted armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks entirely. This made the aircraft highly vulnerable. However, these drawbacks were largely offset by its exceptional handling characteristics, both on the water and in the air, along with its massive flight range. Even after the much more modern H8K Emily flying boat entered service, its tough older sister, the Mavis, kept right on pulling its weight in heavy combat duty. Thanks to that incredible reliability and endurance, the Kawanishi H6K has rightfully earned its place among the great seaplanes of World War II.